Imagine a woman standing in the mud, just a few kilometers from the German front line, in the middle of winter, with no shelter, no bulletproof glass, and no army escort to guarantee her safety. She is wearing a sequined gown, she is carrying a musical saw, and somewhere in the darkness beyond those frozen fields, enemy soldiers have orders to capture her, or kill her. The Nazi government has placed a bounty on her head worth 7 figures, and she chose to be here. Nobody drafted her. Nobody ordered her. She came because she believed it was the decent thing to do. That woman was Marlene Dietrich, and the general standing beside her watching her perform for his exhausted, frost-bitten men with the same intensity he watched tank formations cross a river was George S. Patton. If you've been with this channel for a while, you already know Patton. You know the Ivory-handled revolvers. You know the slapping incident, the speech, the armor crossing the Rhine. But there's a story tucked inside all of that. A quiet story, a human story, about a gun that changed hands in a moment of mutual respect between two people who were, in their own very different ways, waging war on the same enemy. And it tells us something important about both of them. If you find stories like this worth your time, consider subscribing to this channel. We cover military history the way it deserves to be covered. Without exaggeration, without mythology, without shortcuts, just history. Let's go back to the beginning. Marie Magdalene Dietrich was born in Berlin in 1901, in a Germany that still had a Kaiser and a working aristocracy. She dreamed, as a young girl, of becoming a concert violinist. When a wrist injury ended that ambition, she turned to the stage, and the stage, it turned out, was where she was always meant to be. She worked as a chorus girl in Berlin revues, landed small film roles, and then in 1930, everything changed. The film was Der blaue Engel, the Blue Angel, and her performance as Lola Lola, a nightclub singer who destroys a respectable professor, made her an overnight sensation across Europe. Paramount Pictures in Hollywood noticed immediately. They brought her to California. Through the 1930s, Marlene Dietrich became one of the most bankable stars in the world. She appeared alongside Gary Cooper, Cary Grant, James Stewart. She wore tuxedos on screen at a time when that was considered scandalous. She defied categories. But while her career ascended in California, something was happening back home in Germany that she could not ignore. In 1937, while she was in London, Nazi party officials approached her. The message was direct. Return to Germany. Lend your name and your face to the Reich cinema program. Make the kind of films that make the fatherland proud. The offer was reportedly generous, and behind it, according to accounts from that period, was the personal interest of Adolf Hitler himself, who considered her one of the great beauties of German cinema. Her most famous early film, The Blue Angel, was said to be his favorite. He allegedly kept the only surviving copy of it for himself after the Nazis banned all the others. Dietrich refused. Not quietly, not apologetically. She refused. 2 years later, in 1939, she did something even more deliberate. She renounced her German citizenship and applied for American citizenship. The Nazis branded her a traitor. They banned her films. And somewhere in the bureaucracy of the Reich, a calculation was made about what her life was worth, and a bounty was placed on her head. 7 figures. In today's money, that figure would be staggering. She found out about the bounty and, by every account, treated it with something close to contempt. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, Marlene Dietrich did not wait to be asked. She was one of the first celebrities in line to begin selling war bonds. She toured the country from January 1942 through the fall of 1943, appearing before hundreds of thousands of troops, an estimated 250,000 during the Pacific leg of her tour alone. She raised over $1 million. No other Hollywood celebrity sold more bonds. And when that phase of the war effort ended, she asked for something more demanding. She wanted to go to the front. The USO granted her request. In the spring of 1944, April 11, 1944 to be precise, Marlene Dietrich staged the first of her overseas performances in North Africa. She traveled to Algeria, to Italy, to the beaches of Anzio, where she was reportedly the first civilian entertainer to reach soldiers rescued from that brutal, grinding beachhead. She performed in hospitals for men who were missing arms, legs, and pieces of themselves that would never grow back. She sang. She played the musical saw, an unusual skill she had learned years earlier in Berlin, and that consistently stopped men cold with its haunting, eerie tone. She performed Orson Welles' mind-reading trick, which she had learned from the filmmaker himself. She told raunchy jokes. She wore the sequined gown and those famous legs in places where sequins had no business being. Her fellow entertainers joked, with nervous laughter, that she was always trying to get us killed. That was the first tour. In 1944 and into 1945, she came back for the second. This is where the story of the Revolver begins. The second tour brought her into France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and ultimately into Germany itself. Not the safe rear area Germany of liberated towns and Allied administrative zones. Into Germany alongside the advancing armies, alongside, specifically, the 3rd United States Army, commanded by General George Smith Patton, Jr. The two of them made an improbable pair. Patton was everything loud, aggressive, and theatrical about American military command. He was 58 years old in 1944, a cavalryman at heart, a man who quoted scripture and classical literature in the same breath as profanity. He wore a lacquered helmet, pressed uniform, and, always, his ivory-handled revolvers. He believed in the psychological theater of command, that a general who looked like a general made his men feel they were part of something epic. The guns were part of that. They were not standard issue. They were weapons of identity. The Colt single-action Army revolver that became his trademark was a .45 long Colt, an 1873 model, the same basic design that had won the American West. He had bought it in 1916, on the eve of the punitive expedition into Mexico, chasing Pancho Villa. He had the grip panels made of ivory, not pearl, he was careful to explain, when anyone made that mistake. "They're ivory," he would say. Only a pimp from a cheap New Orleans whorehouse would carry a pearl-handled pistol. The quote was real. He said it to a reporter, and it followed him everywhere after that. Both of his famous revolvers had his initials, GSP, carved into the ivory. The .45 also carried 2 small notches, earned honestly, from a firefight in Mexico in 1916, when young Lieutenant Patton drove 3 automobiles at 50 miles per hour toward a ranch that harbored Julio Cardenas, one of Pancho Villa's most dangerous lieutenants. What followed was a brief, violent engagement in the open desert. Patton fired 5 times. He later wrote to his father, "I found out later that this was Cardenas and that I had hit both he and his horse." The bodies were lashed to the hood of his Dodge touring car like hunting trophies, a gesture that was either brave or grotesque, depending on where you were standing. He learned 2 things that day. Always carry a second weapon, because 5 rounds can run out faster than you expect, and fast-moving vehicles can outmaneuver anything that travels on foot. He would spend the next 3 decades turning those 2 lessons into a doctrine that reshaped armored warfare. Now he was doing it on a continental scale, with armor instead of automobiles. By late 1944, Patton's Third Army was cutting through France at a pace that stunned even Allied planners. When the Germans counterattacked at the Ardennes in December, what history would call the Battle of the Bulge, Patton executed one of the most remarkable tactical maneuvers in the history of the war. He turned an entire army 90 degrees in winter conditions and drove 90 miles north to relieve the besieged garrison at Bastogne. It took 3 days. Military historians still study it. It was against this backdrop, the Third Army advancing, the front moving, Germany itself becoming the battlefield, that Marlene Dietrich arrived to perform. She was performing within a few kilometers of German lines. The man standing nearest to her, most often, was Patton. One account places them literally walking together along the front, close enough to hear artillery in the distance. He admired her. He had written about her in a letter to a woman named Mary Jane Krieger, a November 1944 letter that later appeared at auction, in which he added a postscript almost as an aside. P.S. Marlene Dietrich, or how do you spell it, ate some of the candy. The misspelling is charming. What it reveals is that Dietrich was present at Patton's headquarters, sharing provisions, existing comfortably in the same space as the commanding general of the Third Army. These were not strangers performing pleasantries. This was a relationship that had developed over weeks and months of shared proximity to the front into something genuine. She contracted frostbite during that winter. She worked through it. She contracted the flu. She worked through that too. Over the course of the entire war, by various accounts, she put on approximately 500 shows. Billy Wilder, her friend, the filmmaker who knew her well, later remarked that she had been at the front lines more than Dwight Eisenhower. What Patton made of her can be read in what he gave her. The revolver in question was not one of his famous trademark pistols, not the ivory-handled Colt or the Smith & Wesson 3557 Magnum. It was a Belgian-made top-break revolver, a Webley-style .38 caliber, approximately 1890 in vintage, chrome-plated and engraved, with bone grip panels. It held 6 rounds with an automatic ejector. It was, in the language of firearms, a handsome piece. Not a battlefield weapon, but the kind of thing a gentleman might carry for personal protection or give as a meaningful gift. Patton had more guns than most people knew. He collected them. He thought about them the way some men think about books. He presented the revolver to Dietrich sometime during her 1944 to 1945 tour. The documentation for this is solid. A notarized letter from Maria Riva, Dietrich's daughter, identifying the pistol by its description and serial number as the one given to her mother by General Patton. Excerpts from Dietrich's own autobiography mention the gift. It eventually came with a red leather case bearing a gold inscription, arranged later by the weapons historian R.L. Wilson, to Marlene Dietrich from General George S. Patton with devoted affection and for protection, 1944. An 18-karat gold plaque on the grip was engraved, from George S. Patton to Marlene Dietrich, 1944. The word protection in that inscription is the key. Tradition holds, and this is where the historical record moves from documentation into the realm of the widely repeated but not primary sourced, so we should be honest about that Patton accompanied the gift with a characteristically blunt remark. The version that has circulated for decades in accounts of this story is some variation of, "Shoot some of the bastards before you surrender." Whether those were his precise words, in that precise order, we cannot say with certainty. No letter, no diary entry with that phrasing has been independently verified. But the sentiment is fully consistent with the inscription, with the military situation, and with everything we know about how Patton spoke and thought. The bounty on her head was real. The danger of capture was real. And Patton's solution to that danger was characteristically, almost comically Patton. He gave her a gun. There is something almost medieval about it. A knight giving his lady a sword before she rides into hostile country. Except the knight was a 4-star American general in a lacquered helmet, and the lady was a German-born Hollywood actress who had been spying for the OSS and performing for frostbitten soldiers in a sequined gown. It is worth stopping here to understand what the OSS work meant, because it adds another layer to why Patton's gift carried the weight it did. In 1944, the Morale Operations Branch of the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to today's CIA, launched what they called the MUSOC Project. The goal was musical propaganda, recordings broadcast into German-held territory designed to undermine the morale of enemy soldiers and civilians. Dietrich was the only performer explicitly told that her recordings would be used by the OSS. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she did it anyway. She recorded a series of songs in German, including her signature piece, Lily Marlene, a song that had, almost impossibly, become a favorite of soldiers on both sides of the conflict. The melody was simple, melancholy, full of longing for home. The Nazis understood exactly how dangerous that was, and they tried to ban it. Their own troops kept listening anyway. The recordings were carefully crafted. The lyrics were altered, subtly, in ways that planted doubt, that made war feel futile, that made home feel very far away. Dietrich approached the microphone in the middle of Times Square, according to later accounts, and paused before singing. She was thinking about her family still in Germany. She was thinking about what these recordings could mean for them if the Nazis ever traced them back to her specifically. She recorded them anyway. Major General William Donovan, head of the OSS, wrote to her personally, "I am personally deeply grateful for your generosity in making these recordings for us." In British wartime radio broadcasts sent over German airwaves, Dietrich spoke directly to her former countrymen. "Hitler is an idiot," she told them. "Boys, don't sacrifice yourselves. The war is crap." This was not safe. This was not performance. This was a woman using everything she had: her voice, her face, her name, the love her former countrymen still had for her despite everything, as a weapon. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey later concluded that her propaganda programs had been, in their assessment, just as devastating to German morale as an air raid. She was, in the truest sense of the word, a combatant. She just didn't carry a rifle, until Patton gave her the revolver. She would later say that the Medal of Freedom, which she received in November 1947, for her extraordinary record entertaining troops overseas during the war, was the proudest accomplishment of her life. Not her films, not her songs, not the Academy Award nomination or the decades of stardom. The medal, the one that said she had served. Patton did not live to see the war end. On December 9, 1945, after the fighting in Europe was over, his staff car collided with an army truck on a road near Mannheim, Germany. The accident paralyzed him. He seemed at first to be recovering. He was not. George Smith Patton, Jr. died on December 21, 1945, 12 days after the crash. His wife, Beatrice, insisted that he be buried with his men. With the soldiers of the Third Army, who had followed him through France and Belgium and into Germany itself. He lies today in the American cemetery at Ham, Luxembourg, near the men who fought and died for him at the Battle of the Bulge. His white cross, by his own final arrangement, faces the ranks of the fallen. One last act of command, one last expression of solidarity with the men he led. The ivory-handled Colt and the Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum became museum pieces, artifacts of a particular kind of American warrior who understood that war was theater as much as science, and that a commander who believed in himself made his men believe in themselves. The Belgian revolver went home with Marlene Dietrich. She kept it, along with 10 other firearms she brought back from the European theater. She kept it through her post-war career, through her concert tours of the 1950s and 1960s, through the painful return to West Germany in 1960, when crowds chanted "Marlene, go home," and through her final years in Paris. It passed to her daughter, Maria Riva. And in 2022, at the Witherell's auction house in Sacramento, California, the revolver and its red leather case were offered for sale, with the documentation intact, with the gold inscription still legible, with the bone grips still fitted to the chrome-plated frame. When you hold an artifact like that, you are holding two stories at once: Patton's story of a general who believed courage deserved to be armed, and Dietrich's story of a woman who chose decency over safety when it was the most dangerous choice she could have made. She was asked many times why she had done it, why she had gone to the front lines, why she had entered Germany, why she had stood within range of artillery to perform for men she would never see again. Her answer was always the same, always in German, because some things do not translate without losing their weight. Aus Anstand, out of decency. That was enough of a reason for her. Apparently, it was enough of a reason for Patton too. There are men alive today, or who lived long enough to have told their children and grandchildren, who saw Marlene Dietrich perform within earshot of German guns. Some of them were 20 years old, some of them were wounded, some of them were cold and exhausted and very far from home, and a woman in a sequined gown stood up in front of them and sang, and played a saw, and told them a joke, and for a few minutes made them feel that what they were doing mattered enough, that someone like her would risk her life to be there. That is what the revolver represents. Not the theater of war, not the mythology of Patton's guns, but the specific, human decision made again and again to show up for the people who needed it most. Keep that in mind the next time someone asks you what it takes to be brave. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Hit that bell so you don't miss the next one. Military history at its best is the story of people, not just battles. We'll keep telling those stories as long as you keep watching. Take care.